and not for this generation, but for generations to come. And our turmoil in this interconnected world is going to be everyone's turmoil, as evidenced by events in both our region and the world since the turn of the century. Today, the territorial defeat of Daesh, or as it's called here, ISIS, has heralded the return of some sense of stability to the vast territory it once occupied. But the defeat of one of the world's most evil organizations does not mean that the threat of extremism has been removed from the region or beyond. The root causes, particularly the ideology of exclusion and hatred, continue to persist and may erupt elsewhere anytime. For too long, military powers have had multiple strategies to win war. For too long, they have ignored any strategy to win the peace. And for too long, major powers and their regional clients have made the wrong choices, particularly in our region, and then have blamed others, particularly Iran, for the consequences of their own wrong choices. Choices that have been short-sighted and trigger-happy and have ended in strategic blunders. Let me just tell you what these choices were. From supporting Saddam Hussein when he invaded my country in 1980, to aiding and abetting his use of chemical weapons against Iranian and Iraqi civilians and soldiers. From the wars to evict him from Kuwait, to the wars to remove him altogether. From first supporting Al-Qaeda against Soviet Union and Taliban against us, to then waging a war to remove them from Afghanistan. From supporting the same brand of terrorists and extremists in Syria, in Daesh and al-Nusra, bringing Syria to ruins, to dangerously occupying today parts of Syria under the guise of fighting the organizations that they financed, armed, and supported. From Israel's invasion and subsequent aggressions on Lebanon, its illegal occupation of Palestine, and its almost daily illegal incursions into Syrian airspace, to attempts to create these cartoonish images to blame others for its own strategic blunders, or maybe to evade the domestic crisis they're facing. And from bombing Yemen with Western supplied arms. What have these acts brought to the world? The US and clients in our region are suffering from the consequences of their own wrong choices. But they use this and other fora to revive the hysteria on Iran's foreign policy and try to obscure its realities. But did Iran force them to make these wrong choices, as some of them so ridiculously claim these days, that they supported extremism in order to face Iran? Are we to blame? Are we to blame because we refused to support Saddam Hussein? Because we fought Saddam Hussein? Because we were on the right side of history, fighting Saddam Hussein, fighting the Taliban, fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting Daesh, fighting Nusra consistently, instead of joining those who support them in creation, in financing, and in arming. Distinguished friends, as I said before this forum last year, Iran believes that our security in the Persian Gulf requires a fresh regional security architecture. We believe in and have proposed creating what we call a strong region rather than a strong man in the region. And you got to notice the difference. We want a strong region. We do not want to be the hegemon in the region, as we believe the era of hegemony is long past, regionally as well as globally. A strong region where small and large nations, even those with historical rivalries, can contribute to stability. This is simply recognizing the need to respect the interests of all stakeholders in this Persian Gulf region, which is by its very nature a requirement for stability, while hegemonic tendencies by any regional or global power will, again, by its very nature, lead to insecurity. The arms race in our region, and no country probably represented here can claim to be completely innocent of perpetuating that arms race, is an example of the destructive and unnecessary rivalry that has made our neighborhood unsafe and insecure for its own inhabitants as well as for any guests. In a quest to create a strong region, we need to be realistic and accept our differences. We need to move from the defunct concept of collective security and alliance formations to inclusive concepts such as security networking in the area of networking globally, which can address issues that range from divergence of interests to disparities in size and power, as is the case in any virtual network you join. Security networking is a non-zero-sum approach that accepts that security is indivisible, as opposed to alliances and blocs, which are fundamentally based on the defunct zero-sum approach of gaining security at the expense of insecurity of others. The nuclear deal, and I see some people who were closely involved, Lady Ashton, Secretary Kerry, others here, was an example of such non-zero-sum thinking, recognizing differences, but also recognizing that we could define common objectives, and maintaining respect for the interests and concerns of all participants led to the very difficult but successful outcome of the negotiations leading to the JCPOA. And that may be why those who see everything in terms of one-sided profiteering are intrinsically opposed to this deal without even reading it. Immediately after the conclusion of the JCPOA, Iran sought to use the same approach for the Persian Gulf and proposed to create a regional dialogue forum. The proposal fell on deaf ears, but that proposal is still on the table. You know why? Because that's the only game in town. That's the only viable alternative out of the misery that we have been in for the past many decades. It could become, if our neighbors join us, a forum that will be used as an instrument for helping organize and advance dialogue at the formal and informal levels in our region. And while encouraging intergovernmental and formal dialogue, it can also promote dialogue between scholars and thinkers and the general public. The parameters of Iran's proposed regional architecture are simple but effective. Rather than trying to ignore conflicts of interest, it will accept differences. Being premised on inclusivity, it can act as a firewall to prevent the emergence of an oligarchy among big states. And importantly, it allows smaller states to participate and have their interests protected. Like the Helsinki process that the Secretary General referred to, the future security architecture in the Persian Gulf should be based on the ticket principles and CBM baskets. All countries around this vital and at the same time volatile waterway should be able to enter by committing to a series of common standards enshrined in the UN Charter, such as sovereign equality, refraining from the threat or use of force, peaceful resolution of disputes, respect for territorial integrity, inviolability of borders, non-intervention in the domestic affairs of states, and respect for self-determination within states. We also recognize that we need confidence-building measures in the Persian Gulf, from joint military visits to pre-notification of military exercises, and from transparency measures in armaments and procurements of arms to reducing military expenditures. All of which could eventually lead, and I hope that's not in a too distant future, to a regional non-aggression pact. We can begin with easier to implement issues, such as tourism, joint investments, or even joint task forces on issues ranging from nuclear safety in the Persian Gulf, where a lot of nuclear reactors are being built, to pollution, where all of us are suffering from issues such as dust storms, to disaster management. Distinguished friends, at a time when we are dangerously close to escalating conflict that will affect our children and grandchildren, I encourage my counterparts in the Persian Gulf region to join Iran in making this proposal a reality. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We have time
We're now
for a few questions.
speech by Foreign